the idea that people who were very familiar to me growing up were also the stuff of art, that their lives and their work were the stuff of literature. And it really just made all the difference in the world to me.
Hello, and welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am delighted to be joined by Elizabeth Wetmore, author of the novel Valentine.
I came to the University of Iowa Writers Workshop from a job waiting tables. The day that I found out I got into the workshop, I was literally walking out the door to my shift.
Elizabeth Wetmore is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and is a recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts and 2 fellowships from the Illinois Arts Council, as well as a grant from the Barbara Deming Foundation. Her fiction has appeared in Epic, Kenyon Review, Colorado Review, Baltimore Review, Crab Orchard Review, Iowa Review, and other literary journals. A native of West Texas, Wetmore now lives and works in Chicago. She is the New York Times bestselling author of the novel Valentine. So I'd like to begin by congratulating you. This process of writing Valentine, I know it was a long and tedious process, but I think you showed a lot of patience and vision to achieve a level of success that a lot of authors would envy. So I just want to say congratulations on the success of your novel Valentine.
Thank you so much.
Next, I'd like to talk about a New York Times article, and you said that you made a promise to yourself that you would be mindful about talking about what this looks like for working class writers who don't come from families or communities where people are saying, yay, write full time. What do you mean by that?
Well, I sometimes think that, particularly in American, letters, we have this kind of sense of writers as, people who, they go to their bachelor's degree, they go to college, they get a degree, they maybe go to an MFA program, they get a book deal, and then they're off to the races. And for me, that was not my experience at all. I went to college after spending some time, waiting tables and having adventures as a young woman, and sort of worked my way through college. So it took me a while. I started at a community college, taking 1 or 2 classes at a time while I waited tables and had adventures, and then made my way to a 4-year college. I went to graduate school when I was 33, I think. And I'm 52 now, and this is my debut novel. So for me, writing has always been something that I've had to sort of squeeze in around the edges of the rest of the life I was living, which included, always earning a living, keeping a roof over your head, raising children. And I think that, you know, of course, I mean, the literature of any country, any community is poorer when you don't have a great diversity of voices, so the more work you have, by people of color, the more work you have by women, the more work you have by working class writers, the richer the literature is. And I know that we've lost, I think a lot, about the work that's been lost because people just couldn't quite do it anymore, or because they reached an age or a point in their life where they felt like maybe those doors had closed for them. Um, and or because they couldn't work 2 or 3 jobs and then come home and write late at night for even an hour, you know? So I wanted, you know, I've always wanted to kind of, um, among all the things I've wanted to talk about with my book, I guess one of the practical things I've wanted to talk about was, you know, the idea that for a lot of writers, it's important to honor the reality that you're not on someone else's timeline, you know, and that there are a lot of different paths and ways to get here. You know, for me, it was a really circuitous and long path. And I'll be honest with you, aside from, you know, working to pay the bills, I think you hear about these writers who write these brilliant, insightful, deeply humane novels, you know, that speak to the universal truths of living, you know, sorrow and joy and struggle, and they do that at 25 years old. And that's brilliant. But I was not that writer. I'm very much a writer who's had to learn lessons along the way to become the person I had to become to be able to treat these characters with the kind of tenderness and compassion and nuance and sort of, you know, steely-eyed truth, I guess, you know, that they deserved to be able to write the book. So I fall squarely into that category of people who had to get a fair amount of living under my belt before I was able to write this book.
Mhm. I think you bring up an important point about accessibility and opportunity and resources that are available not just to the writer but to the various publishers and their ability to choose who gets published and who doesn't. Do you recognize any ways in which we can improve accessibility to publishing?
Um, You know, the publishing industry, I'm so new to this that the publishing industry is still, you know, very much a bit of a mystery to me. I mean, obviously, you know, I think there's been a lot of conversation recently about the importance of having a lot of different types of people working in publishing, you know, who may have a keener eye toward, um, ferreting out good work that's out there that's maybe not being seen. From my perspective, so I can't speak to publishing, you know, too directly because I'm so new to it. I can say that there were a lot of things that really saved my writer's life. And two of them were, you know, I was awarded a National Endowment for the Arts grant when my son was 2 years old. And that year I got a complete draft of a book. You know, practically all of that money went to childcare. I had a couple of residencies that enabled me to, you know, go to a beautiful place in the woods for about 4 weeks and you know, concentrate on nothing but writing, and, those were real lifesavers. So I think, you know, obviously practical support, is one way of kind of increasing, the kinds of voices we hear, you know, but in terms of publishing, I just don't I'm still learning.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting you say that that grant helped you with childcare. A lot of writers do struggle with that, being able to write and parent at the same time.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, it was a lifesaver. I mean, you know, it was obviously I had to pay my taxes out of it, you know, so I paid the taxes on it and then looked at what was left over. And I think practically every dime of that, you know, I might have gotten a couple of little office supplies out of it, you know, maybe a little cheap printer or something. But other than that, I mean, it all went to childcare, and it was a lifesaver. It made all the difference in the world.
Well, let's talk about your writing. Let's talk a little bit about Valentine. The importance of place kind of shines through in this novel. I mean, just throughout, page by page, are just little elements of the place. And talk about including those elements. Were they things that you experienced yourself growing up in West Texas, or were there just things that you had to research and find out about the place? And also, I'm curious, would you consider the place itself as a character of the novel?
Absolutely. And I will say that, to answer to your question about getting to place, yes, all of the above. I did a lot of research. I did a lot of reading. One of the things I learned in very short order when I began writing the book was that growing up in a place doesn't necessarily mean being able to see that place or the people who inhabit it in sort of complicated a way, enough ways to be able to write a book about them. I left home at 18, and I did not start working on this book until I was in my late 30s. So I had been gone for a long time when I started working on the book. But I still have family in the area, and I'd go back as often as possible to visit family. And one of the things I did was I made it a point every time I went home to go for long, long drives through the oil patch, and then beyond the oil patch into the far West Texas region where the beautiful Chihuahuan Desert sort of takes over the landscape. And of course, like a lot of people, I have a pretty complicated relationship to my hometown. So for me, falling back in love with that land was really my first entry into the book.
Mhm. So, did you do additional research into politics of the times or the oil industry, cattle ranching, those sorts of things?
I did. Some of it I had some inside tracks into cattle ranching. My sister's married to a cattle rancher, so I was able to interview that entire part of the family and spend a lot of time out on the ranch. I spent a lot of time at the downtown library reading through old newspapers. I read some of the literature of that place and history. I listened to a lot of music actually that I thought my characters would likely be listening to given their age and their station. So I listened to a lot of Joe Ely and Chris Christopherson. It's set in 1976. I kind of fell in love with outlaw country. For my older character, Corrine Shepherd, I listened to a lot of Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys and jazz, and sort of tried to immerse myself as much as I could, in that time. So there was a period of time when I was working on the book, when if you walked into the little corner of the bedroom where I write, you would just have seen the walls just plastered with images from the 70s, and different pictures of people and character, who I kind of had in mind as I was writing some of these characters. So
That actually sounds like quite a lot of fun, almost like immersing yourself into an acting role.
yeah, I mean, again, I'd been gone for a long time, and when I was there, I was born and raised in Odessa. I left when I was 18. But as a little girl growing up, in the kind of bottom end of the middle class, I guess. My dad worked at a petrochemical plant for 30 years. I growing up in a neighborhood in a town that was deeply segregated then, I there was so much that I was not able to see, so for example, the kind of violence that accompanies an oil boom, and whether, and that's true, I think, across the board, whether it's an oil boom in South Dakota or an oil boom in West Texas, there's a precipitous rise in violence, and particularly violence against women and girls. That was something that I just really wasn't privy to as a little girl.
Do you think that any of that violence or segregation will shock readers of today? I know I was reading, and you had mentioned in the novel The Preacher talking about the evils of desegregation, and it just caught me off guard. Do you think that will shock readers?
I don't know. I will tell you that the schools in my hometown were desegregated in 1982. Um, and I will tell you that the racism that I was writing about in 1976 was not new to that region in 1976, and it has not passed now. So, as an example, one of the things that's really changed, in Texas are the demographics. Um, in my hometown now, about 54, 55% of the population identifies as Latino. But the last time I checked, there wasn't a single person on the city council with a Latino surname.
Hmm.
Now that can change, of course, at any moment. So it's changed in a lot of ways, and in other ways, those sort of those social ills, that poison of racism, lingers to this day.
Sure. Well, tell me a little bit about developing this into a novel, because I know you prefer the short story form, and I think this started out of a short story. Was that a challenge for you to develop this into a full length novel?
It was, yes, indeed. The short story form is the form I'm most comfortable with, and it's the form that I most love. And to this day, honestly, I don't think I really know how to write a novel. um, but I don't know. Maybe no writer ever really knows how to write a particular novel. I remember hearing an interview. I think it was on Fresh Air with Philip Roth many years ago, and she said, oh, this is your newest novel. It must be getting so much, surely you know how to do it now. And he said, no, every novel is different, and every novel has to teach you how to write it. Each book has its own demands, and part of the process is listening to the work and the characters and the voices in the world, and letting those teach you how to do it. So it was very difficult at first, and really, I think, if you've read the book, I think that the the roots of the short story are there, not only in those opening chapters but in several other chapters in the book. Most of those chapters read almost as if they could be, sort of contained stories, and I like that. I like chapters that have like a clear arc, within themselves. But yeah, I wanted to, in a lot of ways, mimic the short story, but the one thing that I do love about novels is I feel like the novel gives you a little more space and time to maybe explore ideas a little more. And so I really fell in love with that. And so this, the exploration of racism and violence against women, the exploration of the idea that, when a stranger comes to your door and asks for help, what do you do, right? And whether that stranger's a little girl who literally knocks on the door at the beginning of the book, right? Or the stranger is your neighbor who is really struggling. In a lot of ways, I think that's probably one of the most important questions we all ever answer in our lives: is what do we do when the stranger comes to our door? You know. So those were ideas that I felt like I could explore a little more because of the form of the novel. I had a little more time to sort of wander a bit.
That makes me think of something I think John Gardner said, that there are two types of stories: one where a person goes on a journey, and another where a stranger comes to town. Was Did that
Mhm.
inspire you at all, or was that part of your thought process?
Yeah, I love him. Yeah, I for sure. I think I've heard something very similar in some of my writing classes, and yes, it definitely did. Except, what's interesting in my book is that the stranger who comes to town is not a stranger. She's a local girl, right? But she's a stranger to, most of the other characters, because they are, white women living in a deeply segregated time and place. So the way that I had their worlds interact was really tricky, I think, for me. So for example, after that initial opening scene, um, she never directly encounters that woman again. They really do live separate lives and have separate experiences, in that town and in this book. So
We'll talk more about those women, about your characters, about. I read that you said you wanted to write about the ferocity of these women's spirits. So tell me about getting to know these characters, and getting them down onto the page.
mhm. Well, each of these characters is sort of an amalgamation of women and girls I kind of grew up listening to. In 1976, when this book is set, I was about the same age as the little girls who lived on Larkspur Lane. And I really mined my own memories of that time and place, to get sort of the physical details right, but also to get the voices of the girls and women right. I was an avid reader as a little girl, but I was also an avid eavesdropper. And so I spent a lot of time as a little girl sort of sitting out on the back porch after supper, listening to my mom and some of the other women in the neighborhood, sort of talking about their days and their lives in the city. During oil booms, I listened to them talk about new jobs and saving money and their hopes for the future, and also the terrible traffic and the way housing prices would skyrocket, and some of the social ills, that accompanied an oil boom. And during oil bust, I listened to them talk about who had lost a job or whose house had been foreclosed on. And so those stories really stuck with me, and those voices really stuck with me. Um, and so I knew very early that I was going to allow the women and girls' voices to direct this book. And for me, that meant a deep dive into, and an emotional one, into each character's voices and circumstances. To write these characters, I really had to access every bit of my own understanding and mercy and anger. I'm always really pleased when people talk about the anger that sort of courses through this entire book, which is, I think, which was very much intentional. So I had to see these characters really clearly, flaws and all. And at the same time, I had to also see them as larger than themselves. The whole world sort of contained in each woman's story and each girl's story.
Was it difficult plotting the novel by, deciding where to put which story, in which places?
Um, yeah, and I mean, I think that, you know, uh, in insofar as every book has its flaws and its weaknesses, I would say probably plot is likely to be one of the bigger flaws of this book. And I'm okay with that. Uh, but yeah, for sure. I mean, I did a lot of playing with arrangement. There were times when I would just print out the entire book and sort of spread the pages out, across the bed or across the floor, and play with moving things around. And again, I really tried to let the voices in the book direct the plot as much as possible. So, or at least arise out of characters, and how I thought characters would react at any given moment, or to any given obstacle that I sort of set in front of them.
Well, whatever flaws there may be in plotting, I'm the strength of characters and the strength of detail and eloquence in your writing, I think definitely overcomes that.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think a lot about flaws, and the importance of flaws, and the beauty of flaws. I'm a big fan of Leonard Cohen's work. I don't know if you're familiar with the music of Leonard Cohen, but in one of his favorite songs, he says, I think the song is called Anthem, and he says, "There's a crack in everything, right? That's how the light gets in." And so, I'm okay with flaws. So, in a lot of ways, I think that those can be some of the best parts of any piece of art. So,
Yeah, it definitely gives it its own character, its own flair. I
mhm.
want to know about mentors. I know you graduated from the Iowa's Writers Workshop. Tell me about some of the mentors you've had along the way to help you with this.
Oh God, so many. I guess I want to talk about my teachers, but I want to also say at the outset that, for every writing teacher who's been a mentor to me, um, perhaps because of my sort of unusual way and circuitous route to getting to writing and to becoming a writer, for every sort of writing mentor I've had, I've also learned so much from the people who have mentored me in more informal ways. Other waitresses at my jobs, older women who had been bartending for 30 years, landlords who were particularly kind and generous to me at times when I really needed it. Um, so for me, mentoring has been something that's been a kind of part of my daily life and my daily work life in particular. And I think you see that, all through the book. But at Iowa, my first teacher there was a guy named Chris Offutt, who was really I'm not sure I would have made it through that program without him. In addition to just being incredibly kind to me personally, and assuring me that I belonged there. I came to the University of Iowa Writers Workshop from a job waiting tables. The day that I found out I got into the workshop, I was literally walking out the door to my shift. And so, in addition to being just incredibly kind to me personally, um, he introduced me to the work of a guy named Brees DJ Pancake, a young man who died very young, but he got one collection of short stories called Trilobites under his belt first, and the stories were all set in the West Virginia coal mining country, and it was really to me a real early glimpse of the the idea that people who were very familiar to me growing up were also the stuff of art, that their lives and their work were the stuff of literature. And it really just made all the difference in the world to me. I was also incredibly fortunate to study with Marilyn Robinson, who was the advisor on my thesis, and who brought to every conversation a kind of sense of the dignity of humanity and the importance of looking to your work to try to do something a little larger, to try to speak to some larger truth, to sort of bridge gaps between people. And so she was, and of course she's also just brilliant. Those were two mentors. I had the good fortune to study with James Allen McPherson, who again, just a deeply humane writer. A little later, I took a workshop, at a writers conference with Luis Alberto Urrea, who's again, turned such a tender eye toward all of his characters. I think for me, the mentors who've been the most meaningful have been writers who have a kind of deep sense of compassion and and kindness to their characters, even those characters who are sort of deeply, deeply, deeply flawed, or in the case, of my writing, some of my characters are characters who, have kind of been on the wrong side of history or come from families that have been on the wrong side of history. And so finding that balance between seeing their lives clearly, and also, seeing them with a deep sense of empathy and compassion was something I feel like I very much learned from all of my mentors.
Well, I think that's very well said and encouraging too, just to hear that your inspiration comes, beyond just, your education, but from everyday life and from everyday people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as I recently had occasion to do the math because had come up in a few interviews, and I found myself sort of stumbling a bit. I waited tables for a grand total of 12 years. I bartended for about another three. So I've got like 15 years of material gathered from my work in the food service industry. And the folks I worked with in those jobs, taught me as much about writing as anything else that I've ever experienced in my life.
Mhm. This is a sort of out of personal interest that I'm asking this question. I'm curious, When did you decide it was time to start submitting the manuscript to agents and publishers, and how did you make that decision?
Um, so for me, the road to publishing has been, in spite of, being somewhat circuitous on my end with the actual writing, the road to publishing for me has been pretty lucky, I would say. My agent found me, because of a story she had seen in a literary journal. So she reached out to me. So I skipped that big step, and then she was my agent for 4 years before I finally, finished this book. And then once I finished the book, I was incredibly fortunate. The book sold pretty quickly. So I was really incredibly lucky in that I skipped some of the usual steps. I didn't write, I didn't write any letters of inquiry. I had already sold the book when I was trying to put together some kind of sort of, what do they call it? The elevator pitch.
Mhm.
By the time I was putting together an elevator pitch, I had already sold the book. So my story is maybe not particularly helpful because I got lucky and I was able to skip some of the steps along the way. So
Well, I wouldn't say you skipped it. It sounds like you did avoid some of those more grueling steps, but I think
sure.
it can be attributed to all that hard work you put in and learning how to write and putting yourself out there with short stories and those sorts of things.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And yeah, and I'm not, yeah, I mean, I was definitely lucky, but yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I worked on the book for a very long time, and there were months and years, when I thought about walking away from it, or I had to set it aside to earn a living, or I lost my nerve. It was incredibly important to me to get these women and girls' stories right, and I didn't always have confidence in my ability to do that. So yeah, it's the for me, the work came with the book, and then the other things, again, fortunately fell into place.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now?
Yes. Well, like a lot of writers, right now, a lot of what I'm writing is just the sort of longhand version of rocking back and forth in the corner because of where we all find ourselves. And like a lot of writers, I'm finding my writing to be frequently interrupted by my own musings about this pandemic and my own worries as a parent, about how this is going to change my 15-year-old son's life and how it has already changed his life, and how this is, going to change this country, and the world, I guess. So I've been doing a lot of journaling, which will probably never really be meaningful in any way except that it's helping me sort of get through the days and try to, keep my eye on, the possible good that may come from some of this if we are able to do it right.
Mhm.
But that being said, I'm also working on the early pages of the next novel, which is also going to be set in Odessa. This one's going to be set a few years later. So those little girls on Larkspur Lane will be 15 when the book opens, and the region will be about to enter the big bust of the 80s that was so devastating to that part of the world. So my hometown's a really different place depending on whether there's an oil boom or an oil bust. And
Sure.
having written the book now that's about the oil boom, I'm interested in the oil bust that comes, that's on its heels. So
I think that's great that you're continuing with these characters with the setting. I should probably timestamp this interview. Right now it's May 18th, 2020 for those who might be listening later on, just to put that all into context. So, what will readers discover from from Valentine? What do you expect them to get out of it?
Oh gosh, that's such a great question. I hope that they fall in love with these characters, and this place. You know, I although I've said I wanted, it was important to me to tackle racism, head on. As much as anything else, that had less to do with any particular agenda and more with a desire to render the place fully and truthfully, you know. Um, and so I hope that people fall in love with these characters and their stories in this place. Um, that part of the world is not necessarily well known to a lot of people if you're not from there. You may not know a lot about it. I've lived in Chicago for about 18 years, and I know that here in Chicago, when my friends think about the oil and gas industry, they often sort of think of big oil companies and big oil executives. I was hoping, I think, to some degree, to shine a light on the lives of the working class people in that industry, the people who, even in the midst of an oil boom, are generally just sort of keeping a roof over their heads. And I guess I kind of hope that readers will see that place as a place worth saving. Uh, you know, West Texas has been a sort of slow rolling environmental disaster for 100 years. But that pace of that disaster has really picked up steam in recent years, with the increase in fracking and horizontal drilling. They're having earthquakes out there for the first time, and yet, if you drive out of my hometown, you don't have to go very far before you encounter the beautiful and incredibly fragile Chihuahuan Desert, and the little critters that live out in that part of the world. So I guess I hope that a reader maybe kind of falls in love with that place in a way that, even if they're not from there or maybe never even will go there, makes it makes it real enough to them to treat it as a place that's maybe worth saving.
Well, I'm already thinking well when I can get down there. I've been to New Mexico, I've been to San Antonio, but never to West Texas.
It's beautiful and strange, and it's singular. I mean, there's no landscape like it anywhere else that I've ever been. So, where were you in New Mexico?
Just Albuquerque. I went down to the
Uh-huh.
White Sands and places like that.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah, I know that area very well. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, if you the thing to do, I did this with my son 2 years ago. His and his dad's spring breaks didn't coincide. So, Hank and I flew down to San Antonio and got a rental car and drove out to far West Texas. We put 1,500 miles on a rental car in 5 days and never left the state of Texas. That's how big it
Wow,
is out there. Yeah. And we
incredible.
uh we drove the Texas River Road that goes up along the border, and we're out in far West Texas for days, and it's a lovely landscape. I don't recommend going there after mid-April or before mid-October. But if you could ever go out there in March, it is truly beautiful. And of course, even in the landscape of the oil fields, which is, significantly less beautiful, even amidst all of the oil field litter, the pump jacks and derricks and whatnot. That sky is truly remarkable.
Definitely. Well, I've been talking with Elizabeth Wetmore, author of the novel Valentine. Beth, thank you so much. This has been so much fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I can't wait to hear it.